The morning was quiet, too quiet. Sunlight spilled softly across the bathroom tiles, dust motes floating in lazy streaks through the air. She moved automatically, a body going through a routine it had practiced for years, brushing teeth, smoothing her hair, adjusting her posture. Everything was precise, controlled, safe, ordinary. But then she saw it. Her reflection in the mirror, herself, yet not herself. At first glance, it was the same familiar face, smooth skin, calm eyes, a polite smile she had learned to wear like armor. But then her gaze caught the movement of the eyes. They glistened with tears. Slow, deliberate, impossible tears that streaked down cheeks still frozen in a smile. Her own face, calm and composed, betrayed nothing. Lips curved upward. Eyes steady. A smile she had carried like a shield. But in the mirror, something else lived. A silent sorrow, a grief that seemed to pulse and breathe independently of her body. Her breath caught. It felt like someone else was standing behind the glass. Someone who had always been there, waiting patiently for her to notice. She raised her hand almost instinctively. The reflection mirrored the movement perfectly, but the tears did not pause. They slid over her reflection's cheeks, tracing lines that her own cheeks would never show. A cold shiver crawled up her spine. She blinked, and the reflection blinked too, perfectly synchronized. Yet the sadness remained, as if the glass held its own memory, its own secret. She tried to look away, tried to dismiss it, but the feeling pressed in on her chest, tightening like invisible hands. She was being watched. By herself. She thought of calling it a trick of the light, fatigue, stress. That had always been easier than confronting anything deeper. But she couldn't shake it. Something about the reflection was urgent, insistent. The mirror was no longer a passive surface. It was a threshold. A warning. A reminder. Her shoulders stiffened. She tilted her head, studied the face that was hers and not hers. The smile on her lips felt heavy now, almost unnatural. She tried to frown. The reflection frowned too, perfectly synchronized. But the tears kept falling. The mirror's version of her was alive with a sorrow she couldn't name, couldn't reach, and couldn't ignore. Memories she had buried lightly hovered at the edges of her mind. Long nights spent holding herself together. Moments when grief had whispered to her, and she had smiled instead. Exhaustion carried in her bones, numbness that felt like safety. The reflection didn't forget. The reflection remembered. The sense of unease deepened. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She stepped back, breaking the connection. The tears vanished instantly, leaving only the smiling face she knew so well. Dry, calm, obedient. Yet something inside her had shifted. That small crack had opened a space she had long avoided, a quiet, fragile wound she had pretended did not exist. She touched her cheek, warm and dry, and felt a pang of loss she had not allowed herself to name. She turned from the mirror and walked down the hallway, each step measured, controlled. The smile remained in place, practiced and convincing. But behind it, the memory of the reflection lingered, like a shadow she could not shake. The mirror had shown her something she had denied for too long, that the smile she carried was not always hers. That beneath it, a part of her had been quietly crying for years, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice. And in that quiet, still morning, she realized that noticing was never the problem. The problem was knowing what to do next. The reflection had opened the door. And now she had to decide if she would step through, or keep pretending the door wasn't there. The world outside her bathroom was orderly, predictable, controlled. That was how she liked it. Every morning followed the same pattern, every task executed with quiet precision. She woke early, dressed meticulously, made her coffee exactly the way she liked it. Her apartment was spotless, every surface clean, every item in its place. To anyone looking in, she had it all together. Calm, composed, and unfazed. She moved through her day like a well-oiled machine, performing her roles flawlessly. At work, she was admired, efficient, reliable, strong. People trusted her. They counted on her stability. Her smile never faltered in meetings, in presentations, or in casual conversations. Compliments came often. You handle stress so well. You're always so composed. You're inspiring. She nodded and smiled, the same practiced curve of lips that hid everything else. But inside she felt hollow. Her actions had become automatic, her emotions muted. Joy, excitement, sorrow, they were distant echoes, memories of sensations she once knew. She had trained herself to respond, not to feel. The day passed in a series of movements, answering emails, making calls, checking boxes, speaking just enough to satisfy others. And yet, beneath the surface, something gnawed quietly, a presence she could not name, a weight she refused to acknowledge. Sometimes she caught herself in reflective surfaces, a window, a glossy tabletop, a polished metal elevator door. Each time the reflection held a subtle difference. A flicker of sadness, a hesitation in her eyes, a tiny tremor in her hands that she could not control. She told herself it was nothing. Just a trick of the light, a shadow, a tired mind. But the mirrors always whispered the same thing. You are not who you pretend to be. Her home, her office, even the way she walked down the street were all carefully curated performances. Every interaction was a role, every gesture rehearsed. She smiled at coworkers she barely knew, nodded at friends she had stopped trusting, listened politely while her thoughts drifted elsewhere. The world saw a capable, confident woman. Few noticed the tension behind her eyes, the fatigue in her posture, the quiet despair she carried like a hidden coat under her blazer. There were small moments, slips that terrified her. A reflection lingering too long, a glance in a shop window that caught her off guard. Sometimes her smile would falter for a second in private, and for an instant she would feel the weight of all the things she had pushed down: grief, anger, longing, regret. But she corrected herself quickly, adjusted her expression, smoothed the lines, continued the performance. Survival depended on control, and control demanded consistency. The contrast between who she appeared to be and who she truly felt she was widened each day. In public she was flawless. In private she was fragmented. A part of her remained trapped behind the mask she wore, mask she had designed to protect herself from disappointment, judgment, and pain. Each mask a shield, each shield a cage. She wondered briefly if anyone could see past it. Could anyone notice the small tremor in her smile, the exhaustion behind her eyes? Could anyone hear the silent conversation she had with herself every night, the one that ended with whispered reassurances and the soft, unspoken command to keep going? Probably not. It was easier that way. Easier to hide. Easier to survive. Still, the mirrors did not lie. In every reflection, she glimpsed the woman beneath the layers, tired, sad, longing for release. She kept moving through her day, aware of the quiet tension that followed her like a shadow, aware that one wrong step, or one long look in the right mirror, could undo the carefully maintained image. Her life was a performance, and she was both the audience and the actor, trapped in a stage she could not leave. The reflection had reminded her of that. It had whispered that the cracks beneath the surface were growing, that control and denial could only last so long. And though she smiled, steady and precise, she felt a stirring she had not allowed herself to feel in years. A quiet, fragile sense of unease that hinted at something more, something real, waiting just beyond the edge of the mask. She took a deep breath, adjusting her posture, smiling at herself in the hallway mirror one last time before leaving her apartment. The day waited, predictable and unforgiving, and she moved forward with her practiced grace. But the reflection lingered in the corner of her mind, reminding her that perfection was fragile, and that hiding the truth came at a cost she could no longer ignore. The performance had begun, and the audience was waiting. But deep inside, the real story, the one no one else could see, was stirring, patient and persistent, ready to emerge. The mirror waited. Not in the morning, not in the bathroom, but in quiet moments she never allowed herself to notice. In the empty kitchen, in the hallway as she passed, in the reflection of a shop window she barely glanced at. Each time, it stirred fragments she had buried, pieces of a past she had worked hard to forget. She tried to avoid looking, telling herself that mirrors were just surfaces. But they had a way of catching her attention anyway, catching the parts of her that still ached. It started small. A flash of movement in the corner of her vision, a sense that the reflection was not just showing her face but her history. A smell, a sound, a sensation would flare briefly. Her mother's perfume, the laughter of a friend, the soft touch of someone she had loved. And suddenly the mirror was alive with memory. She remembered a room she had not thought about in years, warm, sunlit, filled with the quiet hum of life. A hand brushing hers, a voice soft and certain. It was a presence that had shaped her, a presence she had lost too early. The mirror made her remember the weight of absence, the hollowness that had crept into her chest the day she had learned she could not hold on. She forced herself to look away. The memories were dangerous. Too close to the surface, and she feared they would drown her. She had lived so long wearing her smile like armor, keeping grief at bay with careful routines and practiced composure. If she let the reflection show her too much, if she allowed herself to remember fully, she worried she might collapse entirely. But the mirror had a way of insisting. Sometimes it was a simple detail, the curve of her own shoulders, the angle of her head, that made her flinch. Sometimes, it was a gesture caught in a window as she walked down the street. Each time, a fragment surfaced, a laugh, a touch, a warmth that had been lost. They were brief, fleeting, yet they carried the weight of everything she had refused to grieve. She felt a hollow ache in her chest, sharp and immediate. The reflection seemed to whisper, "Do you remember what you left behind?" She did. The absence had defined her for years, though she refused to name it. She had buried it beneath schedules, smiles, and polite conversation. She had convinced herself that if she worked hard enough, moved fast enough, performed well enough, the grief would stay hidden. The mirror, however, never allowed hiding. It showed her what she refused to see, what she refused to feel, every time she looked. In the quiet of her apartment, she would sometimes stand before a reflective surface and let the fragments come. Just for a moment, she allowed the memory to brush her mind. The sound of laughter that had been silenced, the warmth of someone's hand she would never hold again. She would feel the hollow ache, the tightness in her throat, the tremor in her chest. And then she would steady herself, straighten her posture, smooth the lines on her face, and continue the performance. It was a delicate balance, living between memory and denial. The mirror reminded her constantly that the past had not disappeared. It was simply waiting. Waiting for her to stop pretending, waiting for her to notice, waiting for her to feel. Yet she was afraid. Afraid of the tears that might come, afraid of the grief that might swallow her if she allowed herself to remember fully. Afraid of the reflection's insistence that she confront the pain she had avoided for so long. So she smiled. Always smiled. The fragments of memory flickered, whispered, threatened, and she smiled anyway. It was safe, controlled, a way to survive. But behind that smile, behind the careful armor she presented to the world, something fragile was stirring. Something patient. Something that would not let go. And in the quiet reflection, she understood. The mirror was not just glass. It was a threshold. A reminder. A messenger. It did not judge. It did not scold. It simply showed her what she had refused to see, and in its quiet, relentless way, demanded that she remember. The memory beneath the glass was waiting. And one day she knew she would have to meet it fully. The cracks began subtly, almost imperceptibly. It started with a flicker in the mirror, an imperfection she could not explain. A hesitation in her reflection that did not belong. For the first time, she noticed that the reflection sometimes acted on its own. Not fully separate, not fully independent, but a step ahead of her, a breath behind her, always slightly off. One evening, as she washed her hands, she saw it clearly. The reflection's eyes were full of tears again. She had not cried, had not even felt sadness that day. Yet there it was, liquid sorrow slipping down a face that smiled back at her in perfect, composed calm. Her own chest tightened. She wanted to look away, to tell herself it was nonsense. But she could not. The reflection seemed desperate, more alive than she felt. Its lips trembled slightly, the corners quivering despite the smile she carried. And in that movement, a question unspoken pressed on her mind. "Who are you?" She staggered backward, heart racing. The reflection moved with her, mirroring her stumble with uncanny precision. But the tears did not stop. They fell relentlessly, as if demanding acknowledgement. A shiver crawled down her spine. She felt exposed in a way she had avoided for years, vulnerable and raw. The mirror was no longer a tool, a passive surface. It had become a challenge, a test she could not ignore. Sleep became uneasy. Nights were filled with shadows, long stretches of wakefulness where the reflection appeared in the corners of her mind, its tears replaying endlessly. She began checking reflective surfaces obsessively, searching for any hint of the truth hidden behind her own calm facade. Every window, every glass, every polished surface became suspect. She was being followed by herself. By the part she had tried to bury. She could not stop thinking about it. Questions gnawed at her. Was this madness? Or truth? Was she imagining the reflection's sorrow? Or had she spent so long numbing herself that only the mirror dared show the real her? Anxiety crawled into her bones. She felt her grip on herself weakening. The smile, once an armor, now felt brittle, like it could shatter with the slightest pressure. Her reflection began to accuse her silently. Its eyes pleaded, questioned, demanded. Each time she looked, it seemed to say, "Why do you hide? Why do you pretend? Why won't you feel?" She avoided mirrors when she could, but they always found her. The reflection appeared in the refrigerator door, in the shiny surface of the stove, even in the elevator glass as she rode to the office. The world seemed suddenly populated by fragments of herself she could no longer ignore. She caught herself talking softly to the reflection, asking for reassurance that never came. Her emotions became unpredictable. Small frustrations, long ignored, bubbled to the surface. A missed turn in traffic sent her heart pounding. A careless comment at work triggered sharp unease. She felt unmoored, untethered from the calm control she had maintained for so long. The reflection had cracked the illusion, and now the cracks were spreading. Sometimes, in the stillness of her apartment, she would stand in front of the mirror and stare at herself until her chest burned with the weight of unacknowledged emotion. She would see it, a hollow gaze, a trembling smile, the faintest shadow of despair that no one else would ever notice. And yet she was terrified. Terrified that if she let herself feel, she would drown in it. The reflection was no longer simply a mirror image. It was a presence, pressing insistently into her mind. It demanded recognition, demanded that she confront what she had denied for so long. Every tear in the reflection was a reminder of the grief she had hidden, the sorrow she had ignored, the truth she had refused to acknowledge. And slowly, relentlessly, she realized the truth she had avoided. The cracks in the reflection were cracks in herself. She could hide behind the smile no longer. The reflection had begun to reach in, and she could no longer pretend that it was safe to ignore it. The smile had always been her shield. It was what everyone saw first, bright, calm, reassuring. It kept people comfortable. It kept her safe. But lately she felt the weight of it pressing down like a heavy stone, a constant reminder that every expression carried a hidden price. Every day she wore it, she paid for it in quiet, invisible ways. At work, the world saw a competent, reliable woman who handled crises effortlessly. Colleagues leaned on her, managers trusted her without hesitation, friends sought advice that she gave with practiced calm. She never faltered, never complained, never let them see the cracks beneath the surface. The truth was, no one would have understood anyway. Not really. They would have seen weakness where she had built strength. And she could not afford weakness. Not then, not ever. She began to notice the toll. In small, almost imperceptible ways, her body betrayed her. Tension in her shoulders that never eased, headaches that lingered, a persistent fatigue that sleep could not cure. Her chest felt hollow at times, a subtle emptiness that reminded her how long it had been since she had truly felt. Emotions that should have come naturally, joy, excitement, grief, connection, passed like shadows. They touched her, then vanished, leaving only a faint ache behind. Even her relationships suffered. She was present, physically but emotionally absent. Friends complimented her on her resilience, unaware that they had never truly seen her. Conversations were polite, smiles exchanged, laughter shared, but it was all performance. Nobody had glimpsed the sorrow behind her eyes, the quiet ache behind the curve of her lips. Nobody knew how much effort it took to maintain the facade. The mirrors, the reflective surfaces, the glimpses of herself in windows, they all reminded her. They showed the woman she presented to the world, perfect, composed, and smiling. And beside her, they reflected the woman she truly was, exhausted, yearning, fractured. Each glance was a reminder of what she had sacrificed in the pursuit of control, in the pursuit of safety, in the pursuit of keeping herself from breaking. Sometimes she would catch herself in the act, pausing mid-step in a hallway, staring at her reflection in the elevator door. She would see the hollow smile, the tight jaw, the distant eyes, and realize how long it had been since anyone had known the real her. Even she sometimes forgot. Even she sometimes mistook the mask for the face beneath it. The cost of the smile was isolation. She had become a stranger to herself, a ghost moving through a life that demanded perfection. The reflection's tears, those silent, impossible tears, were a constant accusation. You are alive, yet you refuse to feel. You are here, yet you hide. You smile, yet you are broken inside. She began to notice subtle things in her interactions. The way people leaned on her but never truly saw her, the way she laughed when she should have cried, the way her presence calmed others even as she silently unraveled. She realized she had been giving so much of herself away to maintain appearances that there was very little left for herself. The smile, once protective, had become a prison. Every flicker of grief she ignored, every pang of longing she pushed aside, reinforced the walls around her. The reflection had shown her this. The mirror never lied. Her life, outwardly perfect, was hollow beneath the surface. And the longer she pretended, the deeper the emptiness grew. In quiet moments when she was alone, she felt it most acutely. Her reflection's silent tears haunted her, reminding her that hiding came at a cost. She could not cry. She could not falter. She could not reveal what was buried beneath the surface. And in that act of suppression, she realized the truth she had avoided for so long. Smiling had saved her once, but now it was keeping her from living fully. And yet she smiled anyway. Because survival demanded it. because the world expected it, because she had no idea how else to face the truth. But the mirror was patient, and the reflection knew that every smile carried a price. And sooner or later that price would have to be paid. The truth had been waiting. She had avoided it for years, careful to keep it locked behind her calm exterior. She had built walls of routine, of smiles, of careful composure, and the world had applauded her for it. So strong, they said. So resilient. They had no idea that beneath the polished surface, she carried a weight she had never allowed herself to release. It began with small reminders, an old photograph tucked into a drawer, a song she hadn't heard in years, a scent that suddenly filled the air. The mirror reflected them too, faintly, hauntingly. She could see the echoes of what she had refused to face, a presence that had shaped her, loved her, then vanished in a way that left her unmoored. And she had smiled through the days, convinced that moving forward meant forgetting, that strength meant never collapsing under grief. But the reflection did not lie. Its tears were patient, insistent. They reminded her of the night she had chosen composure over sorrow, of the time she had buried her own cries to reassure others, to be the strong one. She remembered now, the hollow ache in her chest, the trembling hands she pressed into her lap, the forced laugh she gave when someone looked at her with concern. She had been praised for it then, told she was brave, capable, unshakable. And so she believed that hiding the pain, swallowing the grief, was her duty. But grief does not disappear simply because we refuse it. The reflection whispered it back to her, silently, in the form of those relentless tears. They reminded her of the person she had lost, someone whose absence had hollowed her out and left her to navigate the world alone. She had convinced herself that the pain could be managed with careful routines, that if she kept busy and smiling, she could outrun it. The mirror showed her now that it had only been waiting, frozen, patient, for her to acknowledge it. She remembered the moment she had made the choice. The world had expected strength. Friends had looked to her for guidance, for comfort. And she had stood there, steady and composed, and chosen the mask. She had smiled, reassured, promised herself and everyone else that she was fine. She had sacrificed the right to mourn, the right to cry, the right to fall apart. Years later, she could feel the cost in every quiet moment. The fatigue that never left her bones. The emptiness behind her smile. The reflection that wept for the life she had denied herself. The grief frozen in time was not gone. It had been preserved, carefully, until she could no longer ignore it. She wanted to look away, to distract herself with work, with errands, with meaningless tasks. She wanted to pretend that the reflection was just a trick, a shadow, an illusion. But it was not. The mirror showed her the truth she had denied, that she had refused to grieve, that she had silenced herself, that she had lived half alive to protect the image of strength she believed the world demanded. She felt the hollow ache again, sharp and immediate. It was the grief she had pushed aside, now pressing insistently against the walls she had built. The reflection seemed to say, "You cannot hide forever." Tears threatened, unbidden. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain composed, but her chest ached with a heaviness she could not ignore. The smile, once her armor, felt brittle, fragile. She realized that every day she had spent denying her grief had deepened the distance between herself and the person she truly was. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to face the grief fully. To feel the loss, to acknowledge the absence, to cry without shame. It was terrifying. She had spent so long convincing herself that strength was composure, that survival was performance, that the truth of her sorrow had become a secret she could not touch. But the reflection was patient, unwavering. Its tears were no longer accusatory, they were invitations. Invitations to remember, to mourn, to release what she had refused to confront. She realized that the grief, though frozen in time, had never left her. It had shaped her, guided her, and now demanded recognition. The mirror reflected a quiet truth. She could continue hiding behind her smile, and the world would continue to see strength. But inside the cost would grow. Or she could allow herself to grieve, to feel, and finally begin the slow, difficult work of healing. She stared at her reflection. The tears she had never allowed herself finally mirrored back to her. And in that moment she understood. Strength was not the absence of grief. It was the courage to face it. The truth she had refused to grieve had waited patiently, and now it would not be ignored. The reflection was no longer just a mirror, it was a guide, showing her the path she had avoided for too long. The reflection no longer waited silently. It reached. At first, it was subtle, an uncanny alignment of movement, a glance that lingered just a fraction too long. Her reflection no longer simply mirrored her actions. It anticipated them, leaning forward before she did, blinking when her own eyes were still open. Each time she passed a reflective surface, it felt less like seeing herself and more like being confronted by another presence, one that knew her in ways she had tried to forget. She began to notice it everywhere. The refrigerator door caught her gaze in the kitchen, and for a heartbeat, the reflection's tears were there, glistening even though she had not cried. The polished handle of her office elevator reflected a trembling lip she did not recognize as her own. Even on the street, shop windows seemed to hold her captive, her eyes locked in silent communication with a part of herself she had denied for years. It was invasive. She felt it in her chest, a hollow pressure that made it hard to breathe. The reflection was not just glass, it was memory, grief, sorrow, all pressing insistently into her mind. It demanded attention, demanded acknowledgement, demanded that she feel what she had long avoided. She tried to resist. She avoided mirrors when she could. She kept busy, filled her hours with routine and tasks, anything to keep her mind away from the relentless presence. But it followed her. Always. In every polished surface, in every window, in every glimmer of light, she saw it. The reflection no longer questioned her. It commanded. Its tears were no longer distant or polite. They were insistent, urgent, alive. Some nights she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding, and feel the reflection pressing in through the darkness. It was no longer a passive observer. It invaded her thoughts, replayed memories she had tried to bury, whispered questions she could not answer. Why do you hide? Why do you deny yourself? Why won't you feel? Anxiety became a constant companion. Sleep came in fits, interrupted by the sensation of being watched, even when alone. Her body ached from tension she could not release. Every smile she forced now felt hollower, more fragile, as though the reflection could see the cracks in the mask no one else ever noticed. She began to question herself. Was she losing her mind? Or was this truth finally asserting itself, clawing through the layers of denial she had built so carefully? She did not know anymore. All she knew was that she could no longer ignore it. The reflection had crossed the line from silent witness to active presence. It reached into her life in ways she could neither anticipate nor control. And slowly, fear crept in, fear that facing it would destroy her. Fear that the grief she had avoided for so long, now amplified by the reflection's insistence, would overwhelm her entirely. She had survived by hiding, by controlling, by smiling through it all. But the reflection was patient, and it would not be denied. She caught herself speaking softly to it, whispering apologies, explanations, even pleas. The reflection responded only with more tears, more silent insistence, demanding that she meet herself honestly. The mirror was no longer a barrier. It had become a bridge, and she stood on the edge, trembling, unsure whether to step forward or retreat forever. For the first time, she felt the raw intensity of her own life pressing against her carefully maintained calm. She realized that she had been living half alive, always performing, always hiding, always denying. And the reflection, relentless, patient, merciless, demanded that she reclaim the part of herself she had abandoned. She took a shaky breath and stared into the mirror. The reflection's tears were still there. Her smile remained, though thinner now, fragile. And in that moment she understood. Hiding was no longer an option. The reflection had reached her, and it would not release her until she faced the truth she had run from for so long. It was no longer a reflection. It was herself, whole, demanding, insistent. And she had to answer. The smile trembled. She had worn it for years, polished and precise, a shield against the world and herself. But now, in the quiet of her apartment, standing before the relentless presence of her reflection, the mask began to crack. The reflection no longer mirrored her. It matched her pain, her fear, her sorrow. It was as if all the grief she had buried for so long had taken shape and reached through the glass to confront her. She tried to steady herself. Breathed in, breathed out, counted the seconds. The world outside demanded composure, demanded strength. But inside something had shifted. The hollow ache in her chest flared, sharp and unyielding. Memories she had avoided for years pressed against her mind. Laughs cut short, hands held too briefly, voices that had disappeared forever. All the moments she had swallowed to maintain the mask, all the tears she had denied herself, were converging now, unstoppable. Her body shook. It began in her chest, a trembling that spread to her shoulders, her hands, her legs. The reflection's tears streamed relentlessly, unashamed, unrestrained, a silent accusation and a quiet plea. She realized she could no longer maintain the act. The carefully constructed image of control could no longer contain the storm inside her. The grief, the anger, the regret, they surged all at once. Memories of laughter and loss collided with the sorrow she had denied herself. She could feel the weight of every unspoken word, every held-back scream, every moment of pain she had buried beneath the smile. It all pressed against her ribs, heavy and urgent, demanding release. Her reflection leaned closer, as if to push her toward the inevitable. Its face, once distant and accusing, now mirrored her own anguish perfectly. She saw herself fully for the first time in years, not the composed, smiling exterior that the world adored, but the fractured, aching woman she had become. She could not hold it back. Tears spilled down her cheeks, unbidden and fierce, breaking the fragile line of her smile. She sobbed quietly at first, then louder, letting the grief she had carried alone for so long pour out. Anger rose alongside the sorrow, sharp and bitter, directed at the circumstances, at the absence, at herself for hiding so long. Regret twisted through the waves of tears, a reminder of all the moments she had denied her own feelings. And yet, in the midst of the unraveling, she felt something she had not felt in years: release. A liberation that was frightening and profound. Every tear was a confession, a reclamation of the part of herself she had silenced. The reflection did not stop crying, but it no longer accused. It mirrored her fully, without judgment, without distance, without shame. Her body trembled, exhausted and raw. She collapsed into herself, letting the storm of grief and anger and regret move through her unchecked. She had been patient for too long. She had been silent for too long. And now, finally, she allowed herself to feel. The smile she had worn for so long, the one that had protected her, that had kept her safe, was gone. It could not survive this confrontation with truth. And she did not want it to. She understood now that strength was not in hiding, not in maintaining composure at all costs, but in facing what she had denied. In feeling fully even when it hurt. Minutes passed. Hours perhaps. Time had no meaning in this release. When she finally lifted her head and looked into the mirror, the reflection's tears had softened but not disappeared. They were no longer an accusation. They were acknowledgement. Witnessing. Understanding. For the first time in years, she saw herself not as someone broken or weak, but as someone alive. Someone who had survived, who had hidden, who had carried grief alone, and who now, finally, allowed it to surface. The reflection and she were no longer separate. They were one, two halves reunited in raw, unfiltered truth. The mirror no longer intimidated her. It welcomed her. It bore witness to the unraveling she had feared for so long. And in that shared moment of vulnerability, she understood the first real lesson of all. That survival had been about endurance, but living, the kind that included grief, sorrow, and rage, was about presence. About feeling fully. About breaking the mask and discovering that beneath it, she was still whole. Her tears slowed. Her body settled. The weight in her chest lifted, fraction by fraction, leaving space for something she had not known in years: clarity. Relief. A fragile sense of self reclaimed. The smile would return someday, she realized, not the forced mask of before, but something earned. Something fragile. Something real. But for now it was gone, and she was finally free to be herself. The mirror no longer demanded. It had only waited. And now, finally, she could stand fully in her own truth. The mirror was quiet now. Not empty, not absent, but still. Patient. Watching. Waiting. After the storm, after the unraveling of years she had hidden behind her smile, it no longer accused. It no longer demanded. It only reflected. And in that reflection, she began to see something she had never allowed herself to notice before: the truth of her own courage. She stepped closer, hesitant, almost afraid that the moment might shatter if she looked too deeply. But the reflection did not shatter. It held her fully, tears softened, eyes patient, lips relaxed. It was not a mirror anymore. It was a witness. A confidant. A silent acknowledgement of everything she had endured, everything she had suppressed, and everything she had survived. She saw the depth of her own loss. The person she had refused to grieve, the absence she had tried to fill with routines, smiles, and composure, was real. Their absence had shaped her, hollowed her, but it had also given her resilience. And the reflection reminded her that resilience was not the absence of grief, but the ability to carry it without losing herself entirely. For the first time, she allowed herself to speak to the reflection, softly, words trembling from her lips. Not apologies, not excuses, just acknowledgement. She named the loss, named the grief, named the years she had denied. And as she spoke, she realized that naming it did not break her, it freed her. The mirror became a confession box. She admitted things she had never dared to tell another soul. The moments she had cried alone, the nights she had trembled with sorrow and fear, the laughter she had faked to convince herself and others that life was fine. She confessed that she had been afraid of falling apart, afraid of being seen as weak, afraid of facing the depth of her own feelings. And the reflection accepted it all. It did not flinch. It did not criticize. It did not reject. It held her truth as fully as she had hidden it for years. For the first time, she realized that the mirror was not an enemy. It had never been the enemy. It had only been a witness to what she had refused to face, and now, a partner in recognition, guiding her toward understanding herself fully. She felt something new, a flicker of forgiveness. Forgiveness for herself, for the years she had spent hiding, for the pain she had ignored, for the tears she had refused to shed. The reflection seemed to mirror it back, softer now, almost tender. Its presence, once a source of fear, had become a source of acknowledgement, of validation, of quiet compassion. It was strange, and yet it felt right. She realized that the mirror, the reflection, the tears, they were all part of her. The grief, the sorrow, the resilience, the survival, they were all part of her. And finally she could see it without shame. The confession did not erase the past. It did not make the pain disappear. But it made it visible, real, and held. And that visibility gave her something she had long forgotten. The ability to forgive herself for surviving imperfectly, to recognize her own courage, and to honor the emotions she had long denied. She took a deep breath, letting the weight of years lift just slightly. Her reflection met her gaze, steady and patient, and for the first time she felt a sense of partnership with herself. Not control, not suppression, not denial, just presence. Just acknowledgement. The mirror had changed. It had shifted from adversary to witness, from a symbol of accusation to a symbol of understanding. And in its silence she understood a profound truth. She could grieve. She could feel. She could acknowledge the pain of the past without being consumed by it. And she could still survive, still live, still smile, differently this time, with honesty, with awareness, with authenticity. The mirror had listened. And now she had spoken. And in speaking she had begun to heal. Grief was no longer a stranger. For years she had treated it like a wild animal, something to hide from, something to contain behind the walls of her smile and the routines she had built. But now, after the storm of tears and the confrontation with her reflection, it had entered her life fully, and she realized that she did not have to fear it. She could grieve and still remain herself. She could feel and still move forward. It began in small ways. A song that reminded her of what she had lost would stir a sudden ache in her chest, and she would allow herself to feel it, to breathe it in and out without turning away. A memory, vivid and raw, would rise unexpectedly, and she would welcome it rather than push it down. Tears came more easily now, unbidden, but they no longer terrified her. Each drop was a recognition, a reclaiming of a part of herself she had long neglected. The reflection no longer wept in accusation. It mirrored her honesty now, echoing her grief with understanding. Sometimes it showed her pain she could not name, sometimes it caught her fleeting moments of joy, laughter, or wonder. It was no longer a separate entity, no longer a tormentor. It was a companion, a guide through the delicate process of feeling without losing herself. She learned the rhythm gradually. Grief could exist alongside life. It did not need to consume her entirely. She could cry in the morning, then smile at a friend. She could remember and mourn, then cook a meal, write an email, tend to her responsibilities. Feeling deeply did not mean disappearing. It meant living fully, with all the complexity, all the contradictions, all the emotions she had long denied. The world outside remained the same, unaware of the transformation happening within her. People still admired her composure, still relied on her reliability. But now there was a difference. Her smile, when it appeared, carried warmth, authenticity, a depth born not of performance but of understanding. Her laughter rang clearer, her gestures felt lighter, and her presence was no longer hollow. She moved through life with the knowledge that she could feel without being undone. She began to explore old memories with gentle care, revisiting places, photos, and keepsakes she had avoided for years. Each encounter with the past was a small exercise in courage. Sometimes it brought tears, sometimes a pang of longing, sometimes a flicker of joy. Each moment reinforced a lesson she had long forgotten, that grief could coexist with love, with life, with resilience. The reflection became a trusted witness to these small acts of healing. It mirrored her courage, her tenderness, her willingness to confront emotions long denied. She found herself speaking aloud sometimes, sharing thoughts and feelings that had never left her mind before. The mirror listened without judgment, offering nothing but presence. And in that presence she felt an emerging sense of wholeness. She realized that the act of grieving was not linear. Some days were heavier, more overwhelming. Other days brought relief, laughter, quiet satisfaction. The process was messy, uneven, but it was hers. She could navigate it without fear, without pretending, without disappearing behind the carefully crafted armor she had relied upon for so long. For the first time, she allowed herself to grieve fully and then step back into life without guilt. She could carry the memory of loss, the ache of absence, the weight of sorrow, and still smile, still laugh, still connect. The reflection had shown her the way, not by demanding perfection, not by forcing her to forget, but by holding space for truth. And as she stood before the mirror one evening, she saw something remarkable. A woman who had endured, who had hidden, who had faced the reflection of her own grief, and who was learning to live with it without fear. She was not the same as she had been, stronger, yes, but also tender, aware, and real. The reflection smiled alongside her, not in contradiction, but in harmony. The tears were gone for now, leaving only understanding and quiet companionship. Grief had not disappeared, but neither had she. And in that balance she finally glimpsed the possibility of peace. She had learned to grieve without disappearing, to feel without being consumed, to live fully without hiding. And in that lesson she began to reclaim herself, piece by delicate piece. The smile returned. But it was different. Fragile, yes, tentative, yes, but real. It was no longer a mask worn for others, no longer a shield against the world. This smile was earned, shaped from tears and grief, tempered in vulnerability, and polished in the quiet moments of honesty she had allowed herself. She noticed it first in the mirror, not forced, not rehearsed, but blooming naturally across her face. The reflection matched her perfectly, no contradiction this time. There were no tears accusing her, no silent pleas for acknowledgement. It simply reflected what was true. A woman who had endured, who had faced herself, who had begun to reconcile grief and life, sorrow and laughter. The world outside remained the same, but she had changed. Interactions that once felt hollow now carried warmth. Laughter felt lighter, touch felt fuller, connection felt possible. She smiled at friends and colleagues, and for the first time in years the gesture reached her eyes. They sparkled, not with performance but with honesty. She felt herself in those moments, not a version the world demanded, but the woman she truly was. She understood that strength was not silence, not denial, not endless composure. Strength was vulnerability. Strength was allowing herself to feel fully and to survive it. Strength was carrying grief, heartbreak, and memories without letting them erase her. And now, standing in front of the mirror, she realized that her smile could coexist with all of it. The reflection no longer frightened her. It no longer accused. It mirrored her, fully, simply, truthfully. And in that mirroring, she understood that the absence she had carried for so long, the loss, the sorrow, the silence, would always be part of her story. But it did not have to define the limits of her life or her capacity to feel. She thought of the years she had hidden behind her carefully constructed expressions. The fatigue, the exhaustion, the hollow laughter. The mask had served a purpose once, it had kept her alive, but it could not last forever. Now the smile she wore was alive, delicate but resilient, honest but strong. It carried her grief, her love, her survival all at once. For the first time she smiled without fear of being exposed, without fear of being judged, without fear of losing herself. She smiled because she could, because she had endured, because she had faced the reflection of herself and returned whole. It was a smile that finally meant something. Not a gesture to soothe the world, not a mask to hide pain, but a statement of presence, a celebration of survival, a testament to the truth she had reclaimed. It was her own smile, finally aligned with who she truly was, flawed, human, resilient, and capable of feeling everything she had long denied. The mirror held her fully, gently, as she smiled. For the first time she felt the fragile, profound joy of authenticity. The reflection no longer contradicted her, it completed her. And in that quiet alignment she understood that she could carry everything, the grief, the love, the loss, and still live, still feel, still smile. And now when she smiled it meant she was truly here, alive, honest, and whole. The room was still. The sunlight fell across the floor in soft, golden streaks. The air was quiet, but it carried a sense of completion, a subtle weight lifted from her chest. She stood before the mirror once more, but this time it felt different. No longer a battleground, no longer a place of accusation or fear. The reflection was calm, steady, entirely at peace with itself. She looked at her own eyes and saw them fully for the first time in years. Not empty. Not hollow. Not guarded. They held depth, pain, yes, but also love, memory, resilience. The reflection no longer contradicted her. no longer carried the tears of a grief she had refused to acknowledge. Instead, it mirrored her wholly, honestly, a companion of truth she could finally trust. Her smile was gentle, unforced, real. It was the smile of someone who had endured, who had allowed herself to grieve, who had faced the storm of emotion she had long denied. It was the smile of someone learning to live fully again. And in that small, simple act of recognition, she felt whole. She touched the glass lightly, fingertips grazing her reflection as if to bridge the years of distance she had carried inside herself. The mirror did not deceive, did not hide, did not demand. It simply reflected, truthfully, patiently, without judgment. And in that reflection she saw herself in entirety, the sorrow, the love, the loss, the endurance, and the survival. All of it intertwined, all of it real, all of it hers. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension she had carried for so long slip through her chest. The reflection did not change. It did not blink in surprise, it did not scold, it simply existed as witness to her presence, her wholeness. And in that quiet acknowledgement she understood. She did not have to erase the pain to live, she did not have to deny the sorrow to be strong, she did not have to hide to be whole. The mirror had been her teacher, her guide, her patient witness. It had shown her what she had buried, what she had denied, what she had ignored. And now it reflected what she had reclaimed, herself. Complete, imperfect, human, alive. For the first time in years she did not turn away. She did not mask, she did not flee. She simply stood, gazing at herself, fully present, fully aware, fully alive. And in that moment, there was a quiet peace she had never known before. A balance between grief and joy, sorrow and resilience, past and future. She smiled again, softly, not as armor, not as shield, but as truth. One woman. Whole at last. The mirror held nothing but truth, and for the first time so did she.